In 1993, 6 black kids vanished walking home from summer Bible camp. 25 years later, a freezer was found, buried in the church basement. The air in the basement of Grace Abundant Fellowship Church was always cool, a damp, earthy smell clinging to the stone walls. But this coolness felt different, heavier, as the jackhammer finally broke through the last layer of newer concrete poured sometime in the mid-90s. Old Man Hemlock, the church custodian for longer than anyone could remember, had always said there was nothing under that patch near the defunct boiler room but more foundation. He'd been adamant, almost too adamant, some would later whisper. It was 2018, and the church council, facing dwindling funds and a leaky roof, had finally decided to renovate the basement into a community space. That meant digging up parts of the old floor, looking for plumbing access they hoped was there. What they found instead stopped the work cold. First, the edge of something metal, then a handle, then the unmistakable outline of a chest freezer, white, or what had once been white, now stained rust brown and earth-caked. It was an old model, the kind with a heavy lid you had to wrestle open, and on that lid, barely visible under the grime, were the ghosts of stickers, faded, peeling, but still there. A smiling sun, a cartoonish lamb, a bright blue star. The foreman, a man named Marcus, who'd grown up in this neighborhood, felt a cold dread creep up his spine. He remembered those stickers. Every kid who went to Grace Abundant's summer Bible camp back in the early 90s got a sheet of them. He'd gotten them himself. 1 year. He radioed his supervisor, his voice tight. This wasn't a plumbing job anymore. This was something else. The news spread through the small, tight-knit community like a shockwave, swift and brutal. 6 children. Their names were etched into the neighborhood's memory. Deshaun, Michael, Keisha, Jamal, Latoya, and little Tamika, who'd just turned 7. They'd walked out of the church doors on a blazing July afternoon in 1993, chattering about ice cream and Bible verses, stickers fresh on their camp t-shirts, and had simply disappeared. Not a trace, not a witness to anything beyond them turning the corner of the church building, heading towards the shortcut through the overgrown lot next door. Vanished. The police had searched, helicopters had flown, volunteers had combed every inch of the surrounding blocks, then miles. Nothing. It was as if the earth had swallowed them, and now, this. A freezer. Buried. In the church basement. Under concrete that had been poured not long after they went missing. The stickers were the damning link, the detail that twisted the knife in old, unhealed wounds. Could it be that simple? That horrifyingly close? All those years, the parents had prayed, had hoped, had imagined their children out there somewhere, lost perhaps, but alive. Now, a cold metal box suggested a different, far more terrible answer. An answer that had been sleeping right beneath their feet, in the house of God. The weight of that possibility was crushing. The families, older now, their faces etched with a quarter-century of grief and unanswered questions, began to gather outside the yellow police tape that now cordoned off their church. They stood in silence, mostly, waiting. What else could they do? The waiting had been their life for 25 years. But this wait felt different. This one promised an end. Or perhaps, a beginning to a new kind of nightmare. The old questions, the ones they'd tormented themselves with for decades, rose again, sharper, more urgent. Who and why? And how could this have happened here, in a place they trusted? The police arrived, then detectives, then the forensics team. The basement became a scene, floodlights chasing away the perpetual gloom, casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to mock the solemnity of the task. Getting the freezer out was a slow, painstaking process. The concrete around it had to be carefully chipped away, the earth beneath catalogued. Every scrape of a shovel, every murmur of the investigators, seemed amplified in the charged silence. One of the lead detectives, a woman named Miller, relatively new to this precinct but not to old cases, watched with a grin set to her jaw. She'd read the original files. 6 lives, snuffed out. The case had gone cold decades ago, archived, filed away as one of those heartbreaking mysteries destined to remain unsolved. Until now. Maybe. The stickers were a powerful indicator, but they needed more. They needed what was inside. Hours passed. The families waited. Some brought lawn chairs, others paced. Pastor Davies, the current minister of Grace Abundant, a kind man who hadn't even been in the state in 1993, tried to offer comfort, but words felt hollow against the cold, hard reality of that emerging freezer. He felt the stain of it on his church, a place meant for solace, now the site of a potential tomb. What secrets did these old stones hold? The air thickened with unspoken fears. What would they find when they finally lifted that lid? Would it be the children? Or something even more confusing, more sinister? The thought that someone in their own community, someone who had worshipped alongside them, could be responsible, was a chilling undercurrent. It had always been there, that suspicion, but now it felt like a certainty clawing its way to the surface. The rusted hinges of the freezer groaned as the crew finally prepared to lift it onto a gurney. It looked ancient, an artifact from a forgotten, darker time, a time capsule nobody wanted to open. The freezer was transported to the county morgue, a sterile, impersonal place that felt a million miles away from the warmth and laughter of 6 children on a summer day. The families weren't allowed there. Not yet. They had to wait for confirmation, for facts. Detective Miller stayed with the freezer, a silent sentinel. She understood the weight of this moment. The original investigation in 1993 had been extensive but frustrating. No ransom notes, no credible sightings after they left the church grounds. The community had been interviewed, re-interviewed. Polygraphs had been administered. The shortcut lot had been dug up. Nothing. It was a perfect void. Theories had abounded. A snatch and grab by an outsider. A tragic accident where their bodies were never found. Even wilder speculations. But the idea that the answer lay buried in the church itself? That had been unthinkable. Or perhaps someone had thought it, but dared not voice it too loudly. The church was a sanctuary. Now, it felt like a betrayal. The stickers bothered Miller. So specific, so childlike. They were a direct line to those missing kids, a mocking reminder of their innocence. Who would entomb something so connected to them? Was it a trophy? Or a mistake, hastily covered? The forensics team worked methodically. Photographs, measurements, swabs for DNA from the outside. The concrete that had encased it was also being analyzed. How long had it really been there? Could they match it to any specific batch? Any known work done at the church? The questions piled up, each one heavier than the last. Then came the moment. The seal on the freezer, surprisingly, was still somewhat intact, preserved by the earth and concrete. It took effort to break it, a faint hiss, like a sigh escaping, as the pressure equalized. A smell, faint at first, then stronger, not decomposition, not in the way they'd braced for. Something else, chemical, cold, preservative. Miller leaned closer as the heavy lid was finally, carefully, lifted. Her breath caught. Not bodies, not the small skeletons they had steeled themselves to find. The freezer was packed tightly with bundles, wrapped in thick industrial plastic. sealed with heavy-duty tape, and on top of the bundles, placed almost reverently, were 6 small handmade wooden crosses. Simple, rough, as if a child might have made them in a craft session, but the wood was old, dark. Beneath the crosses, the bundles, Miller felt a different kind of chill. This wasn't the work of a panicked opportunist. This was careful, deliberate. Each bundle was roughly the size of a shoebox. 6 bundles, 6 crosses. The stickers on the outside of the freezer, the crosses and bundles inside. It was a message, or a shrine. But to what, or whom? The team began the delicate process of removing the items. One of the technicians, a young man, looked pale. He whispered, "What is this?" Miller didn't answer. She didn't know. But the hope for a simple, albeit tragic, answer, the children's remains, a quick resolution, vanished. This was something else. Something complicated. Something that spoke of a different kind of darkness. A cold, methodical mind. The air in the sterile room suddenly felt colder. The families were still waiting. How could she tell them this? That they hadn't found their children, but they had found this? Whatever it was deeply, profoundly wrong. The stickers, the crosses, the carefully wrapped packages. It felt like a ritual, a twisted memorial. But who was it for, and who had performed it? The disappearance of 6 children was a tragedy. This discovery, Miller suspected, was pointing towards something far more disturbing. The first bundle was unwrapped. Slowly, carefully. Inside, nestled on a bed of what looked like faded, dried leaves, was a collection of items. A child's worn sneaker, a single Keds, laces still tied, a pair of broken eyeglasses, the kind with thick plastic frames, a small, water-stained Bible, its cover soft with age, a name written inside in childish cursive, Michael. Michael, one of the missing boys. Miller felt her stomach clench. Not his remains, his things, his treasures, or things taken from him. A wave of nausea washed over her. This was beyond anything she'd prepared for. It wasn't a grave, it was a curated collection of stolen memories. A second bundle revealed more. A bright yellow beret, shaped like a butterfly. A jump rope with worn wooden handles. A school photo, slightly creased, of a smiling girl with braids. Keisha. Her favorite beret. Her mother would later confirm, tears streaming down her face. Each bundle, when opened, revealed a similar, heartbreaking collection for each child. Deshaun's favorite baseball cap. Jamal's action figure, its arm broken. Latoya's little diary with a tiny lock, still closed. And for Tamika, the youngest, a small plush bunny, one ear matted and torn, as if clutched tightly. It was an inventory of stolen childhoods, a museum of loss, curated by a monster. But why? Why keep these things? Why bury them so carefully, so deliberately, in the church basement? Was it remorse? A way to keep them close? Or something far more sinister? A taunt? A secret kept for a quarter of a century? The air was thick with the scent of old fabric, decaying paper, and the faint, lingering smell of the preservative that had kept these items from turning to dust. The absence of the children's bodies was a new kind of agony. Where were they? If their things were here, what had happened to them? This discovery didn't provide closure. It ripped open a fresh, gaping wound, bleeding new questions, new horrors. Detective Miller knew she had to talk to the families. It was the hardest thing she'd ever had to do. How do you tell a parent who has been clinging to a thread of hope for 25 years that you found their child's favorite toy, carefully preserved in a buried freezer, but not their child? She met them in a private room at the station. The fluorescent lights too bright, the silence too heavy. She laid it out, gently but directly. The freezer, the stickers, the bundles, the items inside. She saw the flicker of comprehension, then the dawning horror, then the utter devastation in their eyes. Mrs. Washington, Keisha's mother, a woman who had carried her grief with a quiet dignity for so long, let out a sound, a low, guttural moan that seemed to come from the depths of her soul. Thompson, Deshawn's father, a big man who always seemed so strong, just bowed his head, his shoulders shaking. Little Tamika's older sister, now a woman in her 30s, clutched a photo of Tamika, her face pale. This wasn't just about missing children anymore. This was about a predator who had not only taken them, but had kept pieces of them, mementos. It felt violating on a level they hadn't even conceived of. The community had mourned the loss. Now they had to confront the sickness that had lived among them. The questions poured out, desperate, anguished. Who would do this? Why these things? And the biggest one, the one that hung in the air like a physical weight, where are our babies? Miller had no answers for that. Not yet. But she made a promise, to them and to herself. She would find out. This case, cold for 25 years, was now burning hot. The freezer was a key, a very twisted, very dark key, and it had just unlocked a door they never knew existed. The focus shifted back to the church, Grace Abundant Fellowship, who had access to the basement in 1993, who knew about the plans for that new concrete floor, who was present during that summer Bible camp. The original case files were re-examined with fresh eyes, looking for any connection, however tenuous, to the church itself, to the freezer's contents. Old Man Hemlock, the custodian, had passed away nearly a decade ago, in 2009. He'd been a fixture at the church, quiet, unassuming, always busy with his tasks. He'd been interviewed back then, of course. He'd said he saw the children leave, saw them turn the corner, nothing more. His timeline had been vague, but no one had pressed him too hard. He was just the old custodian, but he would have known about the basement. He would have known about any work being done. Could he have poured that concrete himself, or directed it? The thought was unsettling. He had been trusted, a familiar presence in their lives. The pastor from 1993, Reverend Alistair Finch, had retired and moved to Florida years ago. He was elderly now, his memory perhaps not what it once was, but he would need to be interviewed. He was the shepherd of the flock when this wolf had apparently been among them. What did he know? What did he miss? Volunteers from the Bible camp were harder to track down. 25 years was a long time. People moved, changed names, died. But the list of volunteers existed, tucked away in the church archives, a brittle piece of paper with a dozen names. Each name was now a potential lead, or a dead end. One name, however, stood out, circled faintly in the old police notes with a question mark beside it. Elijah Vance. A young man then in his early 20s, a quiet, intense volunteer who had helped with arts and crafts, the same crafts where they made little wooden items, the same crafts where they handed out those stickers. The discovery of the items, not remains, created a strange, agonizing paradox for the families. On one hand, the absence of bodies meant there wasn't the final, terrible confirmation of death. A sliver of hope, however irrational, could still survive. But on the other hand, the curated nature of the collection, the deliberate preservation, pointed to a chilling possessiveness, a level of obsession that was terrifying. It suggested the children weren't just victims of a random act. They were targets. Someone had wanted not just to take them, but to keep a part of them. The media descended, of course. The story was sensational. Freezer of Horrors. One headline screamed, "Church basement's dark secret." But for the families, it was intensely personal. Each news report a fresh jab of pain. They retreated, trying to shield themselves from the speculation, the ghoulish curiosity. They needed answers, not headlines. Detective Miller's team began the painstaking work of forensic analysis on the items from the freezer. Were there fingerprints? DNA? Anything that could link them to a specific person other than the children themselves? The items were old, handled by children, then stored in less than ideal conditions, even with the preservative. It was a long shot, but the plastic wrapping, the tape, that was different. More industrial, less likely to have been handled by the children. Could there be a clue there? The lab technicians worked around the clock. The pressure was immense. 6 children. 25 years. A community desperate for justice, for peace. The city held its breath. The faded stickers on that freezer, the smiling sun, the lamb, the star, now seemed like symbols of a profound betrayal. Innocence, literally buried. But by whom? And where were the children themselves? The freezer had given them clues, but it had also deepened the mystery, pointing towards a darkness they were only just beginning to comprehend. The path ahead was still shrouded in shadow. The small handmade wooden crosses found in the freezer became a focal point. They were crude, almost childlike in their simplicity, yet there was an adult's precision in their uniformity. Forensics confirmed they were made of pine, common enough, but there was something about the way they were placed, one for each collection of items, that felt deeply unsettling. It wasn't just a random assortment, it was a ritualistic arrangement. Who made them? Were they made by the same person who gathered the children's belongings? Elijah Vance, the Quiet Arts and Crafts volunteer from 1993. His name kept coming up. He had been in charge of the craft sessions where children sometimes worked with wood, making simple things like picture frames or small decorations. The original police notes mentioned he'd been interviewed. He'd been calm, almost detached. He'd had an alibi. He claimed he'd left the church immediately after the camp session ended, before the children were last seen. No one could definitively contradict him at the time. He'd seemed harmless, just a bit odd. But the question mark next to his name in the old file lingered in Miller's mind. Where was Elijah Vance now? Finding him after 25 years proved to be a challenge. He hadn't stayed in the area. He seemed to have drifted, moving from town to town, job to job. No family, few friends, a ghost. But the digital age had ways of finding ghosts. After weeks of relentless searching, they found him, living in a small rented room in a town 3 states away, working as a night watchman at a storage facility, a place full of other people's stored belongings. The irony was not lost on Miller. She and her partner made the trip. The drive was long, filled with a tense anticipation. What would he be like? Would he even remember that summer? Or would he stonewall them, just as he seemingly had back then? The families were waiting, their hope now hanging by the thinnest of threads. They needed a breakthrough. They needed a face to put to their nightmare. And Elijah Vance, the quiet volunteer with a fondness for crafts, was the closest they'd come. The stickers on the freezer, the carefully wrapped bundles, the little wooden crosses, it all felt connected, like pieces of a puzzle slowly, painfully, coming together. But what picture would they reveal? Have you ever heard of anything like this? Share your thoughts or stories in the comments.